Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last in our series of our Liable program, Preparing Your Soul for the High Holidays. Rabbi Stone started us off with our first session, introducing the Unattainable Prayer, and talked about what the Salanter Rebbe said about that it's that we shouldn't take this prayer literally, but we should use it as an opportunity to do a cheshbon hanefesh, the counting of our soul, a reflection of how we live our lives on a day-to-day basis. And in Unattainable, we contemplate who shall live and who shall die in a very metaphoric way. And then the next line is that through Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, we can avert the severity of the decree. So in the second week, Rabbi Bovitz talked about Shiva, turning. And in the next week, Rabbi Richard Cameras talked about Tefillah, prayer. And then Rabbi Harold Kravitz talked about Tzedakah. And then Rabbi Joshua Boninger wrapped it all up with how we can avert this severity of the decree. So now we come full circle, and Rabbi Stone tonight is going to take us to that next step. There's a next line in the prayer that talks about how we can take this out into the world. And so I introduce to you again Rabbi Stone, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Nancy. And again, thank you to all of you for being here tonight, and especially those of you who have been here for now, it is 6 weeks. Quite a commitment, and I know that quite a few of you have been with us, and we certainly really appreciate it. In a moment, I'm going to share a screen, and we'll start with our bracha before studying Torah. But I wanted to make sure that I did a few announcements before we begin, because I have a tendency when I'm teaching to lose track of the time, and by the time we come to the end, I forget to do the things that I wanted to do at the beginning. So the first thing that I really want to do is to thank the extraordinary teachers on the Rabbinic Advisory Committee of the Center for Contemporary Mussar. My 4 colleagues who have been teaching extraordinary Torah over the last few weeks, we owe them a really great debt of gratitude. And as many of you may know, this is not an easy season for rabbis to have free time to be doing extracurricular activities, and so we are particularly grateful. So Rabbi Cameras, Rabbi Bovitz, Rabbi Boninger, Rabbi Kravitz, did I say that? Yeah, Rabbi Cameras, Rabbi Kravitz, Rabbi Boninger, Rabbi Bovitz. Thank you all. I also want to thank Nancy Axelrod and the board of CCM who have really supported this program, helped conceive the program, and have really brought this first major sort of national coming out party for CCM to fruition, and really appreciate that work. And then finally, I want to particularly thank our CCM administrator, Isha Strasser, who does all the work behind the scenes, helps us all get on this technological bandwagon, and we wouldn't be here without her. So thank you to all of you. And again, thank you to all of you for being with us tonight. So our subject tonight, in the language of the Mussar tradition, is Zikkui HaRabbim. That is literally benefiting the public, or for the benefit of the public. And in a moment, we will do a couple of things over the course of this evening. One is to kind of trace the development and place of this tool of Mussar in the toolbox that constitutes the Mussar activities, many of which have been mentioned over the past 6 weeks, and many of which are relatively well known to people who have even the slightest familiarity with contemporary Mussar. But Zikkui HaRabbim tends to be one of those things that is not well known, not spoken about a lot. And yet, as I want to show, it was a central idea in the development of the Mussar program under Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who provides us with the model for our contemporary Mussar. So before we begin, let's just join together in the bracha, the blessing before Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so as Nancy said, I want to make sure that this particular session does follow in the order, so to speak, of the prayer that we have been tracing, this central prayer of the High Holiday Liturgy. That prayer, of course, the Unattainable Prayer, the dramatic moment of the Unattainable Prayer that we have been focusing on, again, as Nancy said, is Utshuva Utipira Utzdaka Ma'avirim et Roa Hagzera, that these values of repentance, prayer, and righteousness are the ways in which the gezerah, literally the death that hangs over us, in a sense, metaphorically in the context of this prayer, can be averted. And all of our teachers over the last couple of weeks have taken this prayer and I think done an extraordinary job of opening up the metaphors and talking about what's behind, if you will, the cliches, right? What does it mean to do repentance in a way, in an existential mode, in a contemporary life? What does it mean to engage in prayer when our theology is no longer fundamentalism? What does it mean to contemplate the depths of what's required for doing tzedakah? And finally, what do we understand that the decree is, and if in fact, as Rabbi Bodiger pointed out last week, if in fact the decree is a kind of contemplation of our own mortality, knowing that in a sense can never be averted, then how do we negotiate, if you will, that paradox? So with that as the background, I want to move on to the next part of the prayer, and I'm only taking one line, but I think it's resonant with the rest of the ending of the prayer. For you, that is speaking of God in the prayer, do not desire the death of the condemned, rather that they turn from their path and live. And so in a sense, that really, that really sets the stage for the next level, as it were, of Mussar work. How do you turn from the path and live? How do you take the accumulated values of prayer and repentance and righteousness, and even the idea of mortality, and transcend it, as it were? So that's where we're heading. A word about prayer in this context, since we've just quoted a prayer in some detail. One of the inspirations for the theology and program of the Center for Contemporary Mussar has been the enormously fruitful philosophy of the French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. And I bring this, I'm going to bring a couple of quotes from Levinas during the course of the evening, but this one seems to me to be particularly significant at this moment, right? Levinas says that the essence of discourse is prayer. And I just want to kind of think about that for a second. Rabbi Cameras talked about prayer being self-reflective, talked about prayer as being a way of articulating our inner values. And I would want to suggest that prayer, in a way, is also an attempt to hear the voice of others, right? So the plural nature of Jewish prayer, the focus of Jewish prayer being a kind of communal event, suggests to me that when we're praying, one of the things we do is we are, in a certain sense, rehearsing, or maybe a better word would almost be inventing, a discourse between ourselves and the other, between ourselves and the neighbor, between ourselves and the people around us, so that prayer becomes a kind of model for the kind of discourse we want to bring into the relationship that we have with other people. And I think that in that sense, delving into Unattainable Prayer, as we have tried to do, is a way of entering into the discourse between an individual Jew at the High Holy Days and the people that person is responsible for and responsible to. And so we use prayer as a way of stepping out of ourselves, right? Which is perhaps counterintuitive to a lot of people who think of prayer as a way of looking into themselves or some kind of contemplation. But I would suggest that Jewish prayer in particular is a way of stepping out of ourselves, a way of responding to the voice of the other who is outside of us. So I'm going to stop the share there just so that I can look at some faces here for a minute to get my bearings and see whether Nancy has garnered any questions yet. I don't think so. Okay, so I will go back and move on, right? And continuing on the theme of the other and that which we have learned from Levinas, let me begin with this quote. From the start, the encounter with the other is my responsibility for him. That is the responsibility for my neighbor, which is no doubt the harsh name for what we call love of one's neighbor. So continuing on this theme, I would suggest that what we take out of the discourse of prayer, according to Levinas here, and equally according to some of the great masters of the Mussar movement, what we take out of that prayer is an acknowledgement of our responsibility for our neighbor, which Levinas says is the harsh name for what we call love of one's neighbor. And I love that phrase because loving one's neighbor as oneself has a tendency to be a little bit amorphous. And in its amorphicity, if there's such a word, it becomes a little bit more of a cliche, and it generates all kinds of kashas, questions that are aimed at disarming its strength, right? Who is my neighbor? How do I know they're my neighbor? How do you love yourself? Right? If it says that you should love your neighbor as you love yourself, etc. People get all wrapped up in sort of the semantics of that biblical phrase. But Levinas cuts to the chase, right? And says from the start, the encounter with the other is my responsibility for him. That's what the verse means. That is the responsibility for my neighbor, which is no doubt the harsh name for what we call love of one's neighbor. So the Unattainable Prayer, or any prayer, when if it's truly a prayer, moves us along in this process of really moving out of ourselves, encountering the other, and then understanding, sometimes with a great deal of trepidation, the extent of our responsibility for the other. Rabbi Salanter kind of ties this idea or takes this idea to the next level by very specifically suggesting that once we have recognized that we need to move out of ourselves and encounter our neighbors and take responsibility by virtue of that encounter, then we begin to understand that my spiritual needs, right, my spirituality in the language of today is really defined by my neighbor's material needs. Forgive the fact that I forgot the apostrophe. So my spiritual needs are my neighbor's, well, maybe you don't need an apostrophe, I'm not sure, material needs, right? And by the way, I think it's an interesting just footnote that this quote of Salanter's appears in Emmanuel Levinas's great philosophical work, Totality and Infinity. And the almost really very unusual juxtaposition of Jewish traditional sources in a modern work of profound philosophical, secular really philosophy is just an interesting phenomena that suggests that, in fact, Levinas was very much influenced in the development of his moral philosophy by Mussar and by Jewish practice in general. Okay, so now we've got a kind of philosophical or a background to what this, about how we move from the internal work that is often understood to be going on in Mussar as well as at the high holidays, and how we move on to the next stage. So I wanted to do a quick review of the tools that have been developed out of Rav Salanter's Mussar program in the near the end of the 19th century, right? So these are the steps that the typical Mussar group was expected to take. The first is a shiur, right? That is learning Mussar literature. The second was called hitpa'alut, which is a self-examination process, the equivalent of what we are calling in our program cheshbon nefesh, which is of course a term that also applies to the high holy days. The idea of doing a self-examination, an examination of our needs, or literally an accounting of the soul. The third part of the program is called tikkun hamidot. That is learning to apply the character traits, the midot, as defined by Jewish tradition, as defined by the Sefer, the book, Cheshbon HaNefesh, and ultimately, as some of you may remember or know, as defined by Benjamin Franklin, which is where the list of midot that is generally accepted originated. And if you don't know that story, ask me about it later. I don't want to get into a digression. Fourth is the VAD, right? The group work in which people assist one another in understanding and working through essentially their Cheshbon HaNefesh and their Tikkun HaMidot. And then finally, the last level of the Mussar program in Rav Salanter's yeshiva was something called Chachmat HaOlam, or Wisdom of the World. And Wisdom of the World covered a number of different subsections, which I don't have the time to go into all of them, one of which is the one that we've been looking at, which is Zikkui HaRabbim, benefiting the public, right? So a couple of quotes here, or a couple of sources, just to bolster this claim or this understanding of the importance of Chachmat HaOlam, or Zikkui HaRabbim, to the Mussar program of Rav Salanter. So in a book called Rav Salanter and the Mussar Movement by Emmanuel, he writes, in addition to the study of Mussar, intended to arouse the emotion of fear of heaven, Rabbi Yisrael prescribed a complementary means of achieving ethical perfection, which he referred to as worldly wisdom. And then in another great book about the Mussar movement, the author Hillel Goldberg says, Rabbi Yisrael's second basic type of method rivets the Mussar practitioner in another direction. It beckons him to examine the character of the society about him and to aim not only for self-improvement, but for the enhancement of others. It prescribes a new medium, interpersonal relations. The method is termed worldly wisdom. And then in a note to the Mussar letter by Rav Salanter, he defines it as Zikkui HaRabbim and says that it is a remedy, both spiritual and material. As our sages said, all who benefit the public, no sin afflicts them, which I suspect is hyperbolic, but nevertheless, it underscores the importance of doing or taking responsibility for the larger community. Okay? I need to take a breath. Any questions yet?
Well, yes, and it really takes us back to prayer, which you called a model. And so we have a question. Hold on, let me get it. Hold on. That what is it about human beings that makes us require a model, to require how to talk to our neighbor? And then we had another question, which was similar, which is, can you give an example of a prayer that demonstrates the discourse with the other, with a capital O?
Okay, two great questions. Let me try to answer them as briefly and concisely as I can, and I apologize if it's not entirely satisfactory, but you're welcome to ask a follow-up. To the first question, I would say that it is precisely our natural state of being self-contained, which cuts us off from a discourse with our neighbor. In other words, it's fear, it's defensiveness, it's the need to survive, it's the built-in instinct of human beings to close their nefesh, using our language that I think has been spoken about enough over these last weeks that people might be familiar with it, right? So closing ourselves off is an important part of our ability to survive. Opening ourselves up is an important part of our ability to thrive. And we tend to survive before we thrive. And in a world in which survival is often very precarious, we often get stuck there. So I think, in fact, prayer, as well as other elements of religious life, are directly addressed to that kind of unfortunate paradox, you might say, that that we fall into a kind of self-enclosure that needs to be interrupted. And there are various ways of interrupting that self-enclosure. In Judaism, mitzvot are one of the ways, and prayer are one of the ways. As to the second question, just review it for me again, Nancy.
Yes.
An example. Okay, so I'll give a very quick example. When we recite the Amida in the central prayer of the service during the weekdays, right? I'm not going to get into the holidays and the high holidays, but if you look at the central blessings that constitute the Amida prayer, you will notice that phrased in the plural, we ask for sustenance, we ask for mercy, we ask for making a good living, or we ask for health, right? And when we're saying those prayers on a certain level, for many of us, much of the time, those are essentially irrelevant requests. We're already healthy. We're already making a good living. We're already living comfortably, et cetera, et cetera. So the presumption is that we're not praying about ourselves, but rather allowing ourselves to articulate the prayers that are the prayers of our neighbors, prayers of others around us, right? I hope that's sufficient.
Okay, we have a question. Since the term benefiting the public can have wholly contradictory meanings in practice for each person, how is that term defined and valued?
So I think we're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to hold off on that until I get a little bit further into exactly what Zikkui HaRabbim is as it developed in the Mussar project. Okay? Okay. So I'm going to go back to my little charts. I had so much fun putting this chart together. And so we're going to move on to our next slide, if I can find it. Right. Okay. So going back again to Emmanuel Etkes's study of Mussar, he says that Salanter advises that one take a lesson from contemplation of the ways of the world, that is, the interpersonal relationships expressed in social reality. And that begins to give us, I think, an answer to that question that I just put off for a minute, right? Rav Salanter suggested that we look at the ways in which interpersonal relationships, when they are healthy, impact the social reality around us. Okay? Let me say that again, right? We should look at the ways in which interpersonal relationships, when they are healthy, impact the social reality around us. So I want to actually kind of get off that screen and think about that for a minute. And I want to turn slightly autobiographical, but I think it will be instructive. Some of you will know a little bit of my history in terms of Mussar. I came to rabbinical school in around 1971-ish or 2-ish, which was just after the Common Era. And I came there having spent the previous 5-6 years as a college dropout, working in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And for reasons that would take us too far afield tonight, I was particularly influenced by the work of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and found my way back to a Judaism that demanded a kind of heightened ethical sensibility, and that interpreted Jewish life as being anything but conventional, but rather, in fact, a kind of counterculture, which was where I was at that point situated, a countercultural attack on middle-class American conventional values. And so I ended up finding my way back to rabbinical school. And as I've said many times, while I loved rabbinical school and I loved the study, I did not find that countercultural, hyper-ethical sensibility that Heschel had excited in me. Until, on my own, I found in the library a book about Mussar, which I had never heard of. And exploring Mussar, there seemed to me to be a connection that I was looking for between what had motivated me into rabbinical school and where I wanted to go as a rabbi. However, so immediately, if you will, the idea of Zikkui HaRabbim, the idea of being involved in social relationships, involved in critiquing the structure of contemporary culture, of being involved in looking at the lineaments of racism and injustice and in poverty in the American milieu from a Jewish point of view, seemed to me to be the way to go. However, I had had enough experience in the movements of those times to recognize that before one can successfully, if that's the right word, or legitimately work for the good of the public, before one could work for the good of the general society, one has to establish those healthy interpersonal relationships with those closest to you, right? Because I had seen too many people involved in social justice work who were, on an interpersonal level, impossible to get along with, and who treated those people closest to them in a way that did not represent the kinds of values that I wanted to incorporate into my system. And so I began to focus my Mussar work on how to build a contemporary structure for transforming the ways in which we relate to those closest to us. And those ways, it seems to me, are reflected in the first part of the tools that I mentioned before of Rav Salanter. That first, I wanted to be able to encourage people to study Mussar literature, but of course we needed to take that literature and translate it, if you will, into a contemporary idiom. I wanted to create a program that would help people do the kind of cheshbon hanefesh or self-examination that is a prerequisite for having good interpersonal relations. I wanted to use the midot, and I wanted to use the vad. And frankly, I've spent now some 15, 20 years developing that part of our program, never forgetting my original desire to develop a program that would impact the concept of Zikkui HaRabbim, that would bring us back people who had done the work of creating healthy interpersonal relations, and then moving from there into the world of evaluating what's happening in the larger community and how they can impact it. And it just so happens, not that I believe in miracles, it just so happens that at this moment in time, our program is ready to take on the work of Zikkui HaRabbim. not only as an institution, CCM, but as individuals who have worked, some of us for years, at trying to refine our midot, refine our relationships with those who are closest to us. And that readiness is, for better or for worse, being met by the moment we live in, by the demands of the moment that we live in. So this is the right time. This is the perfect time, if you will, for our Mussar program to now connect all the dots from Rabbi Salanter's tools and to begin to create a framework for doing what he called Zikkui HaRabbim, working with the larger society, but always taking with us the tools that we learned that brought us to this moment. So one cannot be involved in Zikkui HaRabbim without continuing to work on Hitpa'alut, on Cheshbon HaNefesh, on Tikkun HaMidot, on Shi'ur HaMussar, right? Learning Mussar texts, doing the Midah work, right? Keeping one's practice of personal Mussar and interpersonal Mussar alive, so that then one can move into the world, the larger world, without succumbing to the self-righteousness and often defensiveness that can afflict those people who try to help those who are furthest from them before they improve their relations with those who are closest to them. So I hope that answers one of those questions that was up there before. And so I want to take the next step in this exposition, right? So now what I've tried to do is show that Zikkui HaRabbim not only was an inspirational part of my own being drawn to Mussar, but was, in a sense, the last step, the goal of Salanter's Mussar, right? And that to stop Mussar work before you get to Zikkui HaRabbim is actually, in a certain sense, to truncate it, to turn it into a self-focused program of spiritual development and away from its ultimate goal as being something that can impact the world around us. And Levinas, again, gives us a kind of contemporary Mussar statement that I think carries this message, and that is, from the responsibility for the other, justice appears. And so now we get a little bit closer to having a functional definition of Zikkui HaRabbim, and that is a cry for justice, right? That is that when we talk about doing for the larger community, the standard, and somebody I think asked about this, right? How do we know, since there are all kinds of ways of doing for the public, right? What we're looking for is a standard of justice, right? And justice, while it is an abstraction, is nevertheless something that can be delineated, right? Justice means that there's a fair evaluation of each person's place in the structure of society, right? That each person is entitled to the respect and the dignity of being a full human being, right? And we could go on and develop that idea, but justice is not an empty term. And while it's always a struggle, and while justice may sometimes require us to debate and to be concerned over different possible definitions, nonetheless, I hope we can agree that there's a kind of overarching sensibility that defines justice in a way that is relatively obvious when contrasted with the kind of injustice that we see in our society on a regular basis, right? So it's not always easy to get justice defined exactly, but it's pretty easy to determine what is justice, relatively speaking, to the injustices that we see. And of course, the idea of doing unto others as we would have them do unto us is a good place to start. And that's one of the midot that we study in our Mussar program. So the idea of understanding Zikkui HaRabbim as a call for justice, I think, is a beginning of our next level religious life. Quoting Levinas, I think one last time, and taking off from this concept of justice. Thus, the work of economic justice does not serve as a prelude to spiritual existence, but already achieves it. And this, I think, is just an extraordinary statement that makes one sit up and take notice, right? If we talked about the emergence of responsibility for the other as being the functional definition of loving my neighbor as myself, then Levinas, in a sense, having given us that first definition, takes that definition to a higher level. And that is to say that the spiritual work of being a human being, the spiritual work that led Rav Salanter to say, my spiritual needs are my neighbor's material needs, is encompassed by this idea that being able to provide economic justice for all is spirituality, is the goal of religious life. Now, again, I just want to caution, one of the lessons that we've tried to incorporate in our program is that in order to do that, one must also do the work of one's own inner self and one's closest personal relationships. The two are not separable. And in Rav Salanter's yeshiva, they were combined, right? So you did the work of Cheshbon HaNefesh, but the goal of the work of Cheshbon HaNefesh was ultimately Zikkui HaRabbim, right?
Rabbi, along those lines, I have a question from the panel. So is one liable to wait to help others until all one's work on oneself is finished? That is, wait until the Messiah comes?
So, no. I mean, the short answer is no. And it's a difficult question to answer in a certain sense, because what I would say to that question is that the level of healthy interpersonal relationships in our present society has reached such a low point that it may in fact be necessary that the first step in Zikkui HaRabbim is actually promulgating Mussar. Getting more people to take Midah and Mussar work seriously is a prelude to being able to help them to have improvement in their interpersonal relationships and then begin to move them toward the responsibility for Zikkui HaRabbim. But as the question implies, we can't wait for the Messiah. Those of us who have taken on the task of dealing with our own nefesh, our own Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Hatov, must work on Zikkui HaRabbim at the same time as we work on ourselves. And when we're doing the work of Zikkui HaRabbim, if we can model for other people our commitment to personal Mussar, that's going to help just as much.
Well, related to that, one of our questioners says that it's so easy to get frustrated and triggered when doing social justice work because of what we are confronting out there. And how do we maintain a semi-permeable nefesh? How do we maintain equanimity in the face of our outrage?
By working on it, right?
Everyone's not going to become a mutharnik.
Why not?
That would be good.
Right. I mean, if you're asking the question, then that's the answer. The answer is it's not. If you're frustrated, and you will be, then the the quote unquote solution that we offer is to do that work that has allowed us to hopefully contextualize that frustration, dissipate it, by going through the work of Cheshbon Nefesh, by going through our protocols, by coming to a place where we can re-establish a sense of Menuchat Nefesh, etc. In other words, that's part of the point that I'm trying to make, is that the work of interpersonal, internal spiritual development has to be going on as one is also doing external development, spiritual work, right? And so, if one feels compelled, as I think most of us should now, to work in the public sphere for improvements in the social structure of our culture, then we should be forewarned that that's going to be very difficult work, maybe even work that will warp us if we don't bring into that work the insights of staying, as it were, grounded in our spiritual practice. I see there are a lot more questions. Nancy,
There are a lot more questions.
I wanted to tell one story, and then I can take all the questions that there are, if I might be allowed to do that. Okay,
Yes,
so
go ahead.
my last slide, right? I worked so hard on these slides, I don't want to, right? So I wanted to give two stories from that might be kind of ways of looking at how to move from the internal work of Mussar to what we can call the external work of Mussar. Now, one is a story that comes from the history of Rav Salanter. So on Yom Kippur in 1848, in Kovno, where Rav Salanter was, there was a cholera epidemic that was raging. Right, this should be unfortunately familiar to us right now, right? And based on the science of the day, Rav Salanter recognized that one of the great problems that spread the disease was people who were either not eating correctly, properly, not drinking enough, not getting enough rest, etc. And so when Yom Kippur came around and there was the fear that an entire community spending 26 hours of fasting and praying and refraining from food and or drink would be a catalyst for a surge in infections in that community, Rav Salanter decreed that it was necessary for the community to eat on Yom Kippur. And knowing how difficult this decision would be for his congregants to absorb, there are actually two versions of the story. The more dramatic story is that he got up on Shabbat, on Yom Kippur afternoon, or around noon, and he sat on the bima, and he brought some cake, and he brought some wine, and he ate and he drank on the bima on Yom Kippur, thus announcing and modeling the permission for the community to take a break and to give themselves some sustenance on this otherwise fast day. And there's another version that says he set up rooms in the synagogue where there were pieces of cake and drinks for people to go to during the course of the day, so that they could make sure that they didn't weaken themselves in the face of the epidemic. And I think that that really is an example of the kind of Zikkui HaRabbim that grows and grew for Salanter directly out of his internal spiritual work. And to offer another biographical point on a contemporary theme, some of you may remember that Yom Kippur fell 2 years ago, only a few weeks after the events in Charlestown, Virginia, and the anti-Semitic and racist rallies that took place, and at the time seemed like an unbelievable affront to the values of normative American life. The African American community organized a march on Washington in response to that rally, and it fell on Yom Kippur. And there was some discussion and debate with the African American community by Jewish leaders as ways in which maybe that could have been avoided. There were alternate rallies that were organized in some cities for the day after. But for a variety of reasons, the Black community felt they needed to go ahead and do what they needed to do in the way that they needed to do it. And so the March on Washington would take place. And in a sense, kind of combining my historical background with my current work and life, I decided to spend my Yom Kippur in Washington, marching on Yom Kippur, doing what Rabbi Heschel had called praying with my feet, which in this case required praying with a train ticket, praying with all kinds of things that would otherwise be forbidden on Yom Kippur. And I mention this certainly not to get any personal kudos for it, but rather to suggest that it is that the commitment to being involved in our current dilemmas in this country can and should and do come directly out of our personal spiritual lives. Okay, I'll stop. You're muted, Liz.
Sorry about that. We have a couple of questions about the nature of justice itself. Could you possibly go back to your slide that defines justice as meeting the responsibility of the other? Someone had wanted to see that again, and for you to go over the concept of justice again as it relates to the Mussar mindset of balancing the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. And then there was another question about can you please define social justice? We hear that term a lot and not exactly sure what it is and how it differs from just justice.
Okay. So going back to the slides, I'm not sure which slide exactly you're referring to. Is this from the responsibility for the other justice appears? Is that the slide that the person is referring to? I'm not sure. But let me just try to answer the question in a general way. So I think that justice, the way I would define it, right, in a Mussar context, is that justice is providing an environment for the other to have a semi-permeable nefesh.
Can you describe what that means for those who aren't?
Right. So if we understand this metaphor of human beings constituted by a nefesh, human beings sort of are a nefesh, and that when that nefesh is closed, as it needs to be sometimes for defensive purposes, that it generates behind that closure what we call Yetzer Hara energy, energy that is counterproductive, both to the good of the person and to the good of the people around that person, right? Racism, for example, requires that the victims of racism, in this America's case, primarily African Americans, but others as well, maintain themselves in a state of less than permeable nefesh at all times. They're always in a defensive posture. And that's always going to result in a certain amount of Yetzer Hara energy that becomes the norm. Victims of crime, prisoners who are incarcerated, also, right? Anyone who has to live with a permanently closed or almost closed nefesh is going to be afflicted in some way by the Yetzer Hara energy that generates. And so I would suggest that justice is the ability of the other, in this case us, or the society, to allow that person to sufficiently relax to be able to maintain a semi-permeable nefesh, and therefore generate Yetzer HaTov energy rather than Yetzer Hara. Now, this is a generalization. The fact of the matter is many people who are victimized have an incredible ability to maintain a semi-permeable nefesh. You know, the folks at the church in Virginia who forgave the person who came in and massacred people in their church, those people have an extraordinarily semi-permeable nefesh, if you will, and live and have chosen to live in Yetzer HaTov energy. But unfortunately, I think that's the exception and not the rule. And by the way, I think it is made possible by the depth of those people's spiritual lives, which is a kind of non-Jewish equivalent of Mussar. So because those folks in that black church essentially are Mussarniks in our terminology, they were able to be forgiving, etc. So I don't know if that answers the question, but these are all very complicated questions, and I'm trying not to oversimplify.
Well, we have time for one more, and I want it to be my question because I've been thinking about this a lot. Even though we've been talking about the Unattainable Prayer, what this whole discussion has called up for me is the Vidui prayer, the confession that we do over the holidays, because it's in the plural. It's for the sins we have committed. So you spoke a few days ago in my presence about the confession that you would suggest for this holiday season. Can you talk a little more about that?
So, yeah, I mean, first of all, confession is a communal process of cheshbon nefesh. Right? It's a way a community can take stock of its state, right? What its present state is, and the traditional vidui or confession in the High Holiday liturgy, I think most people are familiar with, is in fact in the plural, and that represents, in my view, what we talked about earlier, and that is that when we hear the confession, or when we recite the confession and therefore hear it, we are not to be thinking about whether or not this is a sin we have committed, but rather whether this is a sin that our community has committed, and therefore, on some level, that we are, as part of that community, responsible for it, and therefore, of course, responsible for addressing it. I think in the American context, the need for confession is extraordinary. Right? The recognition, the simple recognition and articulation of the sins, to be exact, that we have committed as a nation. The sin of racism, the sin of genocide of Native peoples, the sin of corporate greed, the sin of ethnic prejudice. These are profoundly and deeply rooted in American culture. And the myths which we have constructed to hide these sins is crumbling. And I think that's probably the best news that we can take into this holiday season. But the crumbling of the myths is very destabilizing and very threatening. And I think that one of the ways that we can assist people in dealing with the crumbling myths is by organizing a nationwide program, government, if you will, sanctioned, as well as contributions from all aspects of our society, to be involved in a national process of confession and reconciliation, as has been done in other societies in which injustices have been overthrown. So in Cambodia and in South Africa, the only way those societies could move forward was by taking responsibility for what happened and moving to reconcile with those that they had harmed. I don't see any way for America to move forward until we can, at the very least, admit what we have been for all these 400 years of our history.
Thank you, Rabbi Stone. This has been an extraordinary session and an extraordinary series. I think I speak for all of us who have been participating. I thank you all for coming. I just want to have a few closing words. If you missed any sessions, they are available on our website, as are the sources that our rabbis used. We will shortly be sending out a survey to all of you who participated. We would really greatly appreciate it if you would send it back with your comments, your responses, so that we can build even better programs in the future. If you are interested in continuing with one of our programs, we have Seeds of Mussar. Yes, Isha just put it up, contemporarymussar.org. Thank you, Isha. If you are interested in taking a class, we have openings in some beginning classes coming up. And I didn't get a chance to mention that I am going to be teaching a class this fall on Mussar and anti-racism, which I was going to have closed to just graduates of our program, but have been convinced that it is just so timely and there's so much interest that I'm opening to anyone. Whether you've studied Mussar or not, it can be your gateway into Mussar, and that will be starting in October. The information is on our website. And finally, if you enjoyed our program, these programs take a lot of resources, and we would greatly appreciate your high holiday donations, which you can also do on our website. So thank you, Shana Tova. Have a very peaceful, healthy, I hope, and joyous New Year. Bye-bye.